First of all, thank you everyone for joining us. I believe this is our third weekly Coffee with CoPeace. And as Craig mentioned, today's is a little later in the day. So not necessarily coffee, it can be a beverage of choice. We do not discriminate, but appreciate everyone's time. Glad to see everyone on the call. Hope you're all safe and well, and getting through this rather challenging time. And we've found that these calls have been just a little bit of a breath of fresh air. We try to keep it very informal, very social, as well as informative and interactive. So please feel free to jump in anytime. We will leave time for questions and answers towards the end of the half an hour. I see a few new faces on this call, so I'm going to give just a really brief overview of CoPeace. We are a holding company seeking out businesses that demonstrate positive impact for both the planet and society. We also believe that without a margin, there is no mission. So our targets need to be financially viable, and we're looking to build a good portfolio that will basically disrupt the world of capitalism and make it more of a force for good than it has been historically. So that's kind of just a high level of CoPeace. We have plenty of materials we'd be happy to send out if you are interested in wanting a little more detailed information. But that's an overview of that. I'm going to pass the baton over to Ed Tepper. He's our Chief Operating Officer. First, I should have introduced myself. My name's Meg Maston, if you don't know me. I'm going to pass it on to Ed Tepper. He's our Chief Operating Officer, currently based in Morristown, New Jersey, and he's going to give a little insight into crowdfunding and that world of equity fundraising. So.
Thanks, Meg, and welcome everyone. It's great to see all of you here. I feel like we're all participating in the old game show, the Hollywood Squares, here, when you see all the things. This is far more extensive than the Brady Bunch view. But, I think I've exhausted the TV references for now, but I do have a background in television, so I couldn't resist. Anyway, welcome all on this Friday afternoon or morning, depending on what time zone you're in. Really what I wanted to do was to just talk about the evolution of the way in which we intend to raise capital in the future by democratizing investments through a direct public offering. Just by a little bit of background, many of you are probably familiar with the way in which social, personal, and emotional causes have been funded through crowdfunding, where people are getting behind things that interest them, things that they're passionate about, and people would donate funds to those things through various platforms like GoFundMe, Kickstarter, WeFunder, SeedVest, etc. What was really interesting to me about that was that people were supporting causes in the way they would charitable activities by just putting money behind it and expecting nothing in return, or expecting a perk or something of that nature, where as a thank you for support, they would receive a hat, a t-shirt, a sample of a product, etc. Things that would just acknowledge and say thank you for the support. The interesting and overwhelming response to that sort of activity of people supporting things that they care about is that as part of the small business development legislation that has taken place, crowdfunding has evolved into something greater than just people putting money towards causes. Now people have the opportunity to have a stake in the outcome. So what does that look like? Well, as things have evolved, people have a chance not only to support causes, but own a piece of the action, if you will, to buy equity through something called a equity crowdfunding platform, where we can do it. What we intend to do is something Reg A Plus, which is a process that we would go through with the SEC to get their approval to then raise capital through a funding platform. There are other kinds of crowdfunding methods and techniques, but I think the important thing is that it changes the nature of things. Typically, while you talk about democratization of investment, if you own stock in a public company, is that really a democratic process? Well, it depends how much money you have to spend, how much you can invest, who your broker is or how you access those capital markets. What the direction that we've been going in and the direction of the crowdfunding world in general has been, access is really open to everyone. It's not excluded by the ability of someone to have network or have the right broker, the right connections, the right access to those sorts of tools. So, what's been really great about the development of these things is also it's not subject to the same kinds of market fluctuations that you have with a publicly traded stock market, when we've watched things go up and down. And we've watched, the stock market go up, but then we look at the general population. How has it really benefited the general population? Well, I think that depends how much you had invested in the stock market. Depends whether or not you had access to those sorts of funds. It depends on, whether people have retirement plans or not as part of the benefit. So, we feel very good about the direction of the way crowdfunding has evolved and developed into something where people can not only support things that they care about, but also be able to have a stake in the outcome by fueling their passions and their interests in doing good by using a vehicle like the direct public offering. And it's a particularly good time for that now, because I think watching the stock market fluctuations can be very trying, particularly now where there's been enormous swings and erosion of people's net worth. Investing in private companies through a crowdfunding platform and using the Reg A Plus, like what we're doing and what we intend to do and what other companies have done, is interesting. And we can also have a little fun with it too. In learning about what this represents, we can see examples of success of companies that have raised money that way. One company in particular that's done something pretty fun is a company called Brewdog, which started out as a craft brewing company in the UK. Some passionate guys that developed this business and have built it into an over $1 billion a year business that successfully raised a tremendous amount of capital through these equity funding vehicles and expanded from the UK. Now expanding in the United States with brew pubs, a hotel, as well as other sorts of, the traditional sale of alcoholic beverages. What's interesting about what they've done is they've created a sense of community around a passionate group of people that really like what this brand is about, what it represents. They like the whole lifestyle, not just the product itself. And one of the things that they did that was pretty creative in creating that community was naming their investor group. They call all their investors punks. Now, I guess because it was a British company to begin with, that has a certain connotation in Britain that may be different from what it is here. But at the same time, people really rallied around the idea of being punks and being supporters of this entity. And so we've looked at that very closely because we feel that we're going to continue to build a very strong community, and we want to have our own version of punks. Now, we're not going to call ourselves punks, but we're thinking through what some of those things are, and we have a creative group of folks here that are vetting some various ideas, and you'll start to hear about this more and more as we come to some kind of consensus on what we want to call ourselves and how we want to grow our community and what we want to call ourselves and be proud in calling ourselves. But I won't spill the beans yet until we're ready to share more extensively what that's about. But really today was just a matter of saying, we've learned a lot from the success of others as well as the challenges that those have faced, and we're approaching the market with a strategy in mind that takes into account providing greater access, being less subject to the day-to-day fluctuations of the marketplace, and having fun by building a community of people, like-minded individuals that want to support and care for things that are meant to do good. So anyway, I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon here. And we have a lot of other people to hear from today, so I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you. Let's pass it over to Hanan, our Chief Financial Officer. He's going to give us just a really quick snapshot of the economic markets and the forecast in the midst of COVID. Go for it, Hanan.
Yeah, well, this is the third time we're doing it, so I think this is pretty easy for me to do the economic forecast, because the economic forecast is unfortunately uncertainty. I think that's where we're all living and we're all being, and everything that you guys read in the news or anything that's saying, I take everything with a grain of salt, right? We're seeing a lot of murmurs and rumors about everybody coming back on May 1st. And, we can have, I think, a half an hour conversation just about the date and time that everybody thinks that the economy is going to really open up, quote unquote, back. Then we can have another half an hour conversation, how that's going to look like it's going to open up. And then what the effects are actually going to be when we take a look a couple of months and take a retroactive look back and see what the actual ripple effects have been on the economy. So I think the most important thing is the way we look at the economy right now is to take everything with a grain of salt, really focus on what is happening day in and day out, and understand that there's going to be ripple effects. And I'm not trying to be negative or create a negative atmosphere, but even if everything went to normal tomorrow, we have created an event that's going to have ripple effects going into the rest of 2020 and probably into 2021. And deciphering them and looking into those and understanding the whole scope of those is going to take time. So I would just advise everybody to just take their time, use caution, not jump into too much of the political environment that is trying to artificially boost the economy, but really look at the economic situation where restaurants are closed, businesses are closed, things are not going to be opening as usual, and think about how that's going to trickle down into every aspect of the economy, and make decisions with the idea around it. Like Ed said, probably decisions that are not as straightforward as, I'm going to put my money in the stock market because the stock market is always going to go up. I'm going to invest in real estate because real estate always goes up, especially in areas like Denver, where real estate has been big. I think we're going to see disruption to all those markets. So really evaluating the way we look at the economy, now is a perfect time to take a step back and kind of do an overview of what has been working, what has not been working, how do we think it's working, and where we're going from here. And be happy to expand when we have time, but you guys didn't come to see me today. You come to see Dr. Townsend, so I'll pass to that.
Craig, you want to,
yeah,
go for it.
Thank you, Hanan and Ed and Meg. Really appreciate everybody coming in today. I think one of the things that is going to help us get through all this is science. I was approached last night by a friend of mine who was working in a lab in California, and he heard that we had a couple of people on our team that had gone through the virus, and he said, we want their spit. So he's sending out some kits to several people on our team, and I think that's a good transition to introducing Dr. Alan Townsend. We're extremely pleased to have Alan with us today. He is a scientist, author, is a provost at Colorado College, where two of my sons have gone. I've got one of my sons and his girlfriend taking a final right now for the end of their block downstairs. So we're also fighting for the internet. But Dr. Townsend is devoted to understanding our changing planet and the sustainable relationship between human progress and the environment. And I've gotten to know him a little bit through some of the things I've done at Colorado College, and have been extremely impressed by him and really appreciate him willing to spend some time with us today. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Townsend.
Oh, well, thanks, Craig. I was laughing for a moment, not to jump on you there, but I think it's the first time that spit has been a transition to an introduction for me.
Well, I was going to use the hairdo, but I decided to go with the.
Yeah, I got my hat right here too, but yeah, I didn't. So, I mean, first, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's actually really a pleasure for me to do this. And to learn more about your organization. And I want to get back to that for the comment in a moment. But let me jump in with a couple of things to start. And the first thing I want to say, and especially given what you just said, that some members of the team right here, maybe some of you that I'm looking at right now, have actually gone through this infection, that, Craig had asked me to talk more broadly about the link between COVID-19 and the environment and some of those broader themes, and I'll get into that a little bit. But before I do, I've done this in a few forums already as this has unfolded, and I will admit that I have a little bit of mixed feelings about doing so. Because we are in the midst of a true human tragedy at the moment, and those links are very real and ones that we have to pay attention to and we have to think about going forward. But what's most important at the moment is that we just recognize the human grief and stress of all this, that it's with us, that it's going to be with us, and that needs to be a unifying force as much as it can. And there's really nothing more important than that. I know we feel it in my own family, and I'm sure all of you feel it in yours too. So I hope you all stay safe and well going forward. The other thing I want to say is kind of opening broader comments on this are twofold. One, I like to do interactive things and not just talk at people, even though I spent a lot of years as a professor, believe it or not. And so I'd much rather keep my initial comments short and then just open it up to all of you to ask whatever you might want to ask, and we can take this wherever you want to take it. So I won't say a lot in this. What I will say at the beginning of this is that, and Craig knows this about me, but this is genuine in how I look at these things, that we really need to look at this moment in time as best we can in this broader context, not with despair and division, but with a lot of agency and hope. And I still believe there are reasons to do so. This is a very interesting thing for me to watch play out. What we're seeing right now is something that I've basically known sooner or later would happen for most of my adult life and professional career as a biologist. I've worked in the area of infectious disease. There's no surprise in any of this to me. And so that fear has always been there, but it's not a surprise. And simultaneously, I've worked in the whole time about kind of broader environmental issues, including issues around climate change. And for all of the frustration that many of us feel in that, for all of the sort of fear and worry that increasing fractions of the globe feel around the things that we're facing, I will say, with all honesty, that prior to this hitting, I was seeing some things play out around the world in the last year or two, which were markedly different than anything I've seen in a 30-year career, in terms of the level of engagement on the world stage about the challenges we really face and the desire and willingness to step up and do something different about it. Incredible rising voice of young people in a way that we've never seen before, but not just restricted to them. And that's really where a lot of my hope lies, is that, the science matters. It matters absolutely. The technical and other scientific solutions to the problems we face will be essential, but ultimately these are all human problems. Ultimately, these boil down to choices that we make as individuals and as governments and as collectives. And, on the one hand, that can be depressing, but on the other hand, if we look at history and we look at things, we can see the power of people to come together and change things in a real hell of a hurry. And I put a lot of my hope in that. If I step outside of our current moment and the disease issue and just talk about climate change for a moment, there's a graph that I sometimes show that I won't hit you with today, but the short version of the graph is just that for all the stuff we're facing, far and away, the bulk of the future that we face in terms of our climate future still lies within the choices that we make. We are committed to some momentum. We are committed to a future that's different than it could have been a generation ago. But most of that uncertainty is still up to the choices we make. So I choose to take that as a really hopeful sign. I choose to take that as a situation where we're not lost yet, where we have a lot of agency in what we can do. And that same situation still translates to other parts of our relationship with the planet and the environment as a whole, including the one that we're seeing playing out in real time right now. So, what we're seeing now on the heels of what I've seen, the way I view this is that we're getting a hell of a wake-up call. So let's answer it. And we can. We really can as we get through this. I think we are capable of doing things very differently as a species. And by doing so, not setting ourselves back, but thriving even more. I genuinely believe that. And I think there's science and evidence behind it, that that's true. I think it's in front of us and we just have to grab it. And that brings me back to your organization. These are not the kinds of problems that will be solved and that we'll move forward on if they're restricted to certain realms. We can't solve them through the realm of science alone. We can't solve them through the realm of government action alone. We can only solve them through the realm of all sectors coming together, and in particular, the broad realm of the private sector and all of its manifestations doing so as well. There's enormous power in that. And so organizations like yours that are trying to think about what are the systems that we have, wherever they exist, whether it's in this country and beyond, and how do we rethink those systems in ways that you can find the win-win, and ways that you can use existing systems to have greater good without setting people back or finding those sweet spots. I think that's absolutely essential, and I think we're seeing a lot of evidence for that happening. Again, I'd go back to climate for a moment. There's some really marked differences between, for example, some of the rhetoric that we might hear from our current U.S. administration and the lack of progress and some of what goes on there, and the reality of what's going on the ground at all kinds of levels, from private companies to smaller scale governments at the local scale to state governments and the rest. There really is a lot happening, and that's where the power will come from. So that's why I'm actually quite thrilled to be here today, because I think organizations like this matter a great deal. So let me do this. Let me just talk for a few minutes about kind of diseases in the environment. Some of you may know all this, and some maybe new, some of you, I don't know where your background lies, but I'll just kind of make a few points on this and a little history, and then I'll stop. And I promise I will shut up and open it up to questions. First thing I'll say around this is that, you know, when this stuff plays out, there's often this very natural rhetoric and response of, this thing is coming from the unknown wilds to get us, right? And it's almost like this foreign invader analogies, and or we're at war or all the rest, and it's really critical for all of us to recognize as humans that it actually isn't about them, it's about us. We're seeing this because of our own practices and our own behavior, and I'm not castigating all of that. It's all of that as a product of enormous, just incredible success we've had as a human species over the last 3 or 4 generations. I mean, where we sit today relative to where we sat a century ago is absolutely astonishing, and there's so much good in that purely through a public health lens, right? I mean, our advances in public health as a human species in the last several decades are staggering. They're very much a product of, in many ways, the economic system we have. They're a product of the energy systems we have. They're a product of the resource extraction systems we have. For all of their downsides, that has fueled a lot of positive movement in our public health ability as well. So the way I see this is not like, okay, let's hammer everybody in the past for it. And there's stuff that we could hammer on, but it's more, now we're at a transitional moment. Now we have to recognize that and figure out, what do we keep? How do we learn more sustainable practices? How do we keep some of that stuff and move forward? But also just talk honestly and recognize honestly where the risks lie. And in the case of these kinds of diseases, they're there and they're going to be there, and they're likely to increase unless we change. And so, the term, if you've seen it or not, for a kind of disease like COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 or whatever term you want to use for it, it's a zoonotic disease, which means it has an animal origin, and in this case, jumped from a wildlife origin. The clearest evidence for this one so far is it probably is originated within bats. It may have made an intermediate stop in pangolins, if you know what pangolins are. We can't say that for certain yet, but pretty clearly it has this wildlife origin. And this bridge that came from, one part of the wild world into us. 60% or more and rising of the new diseases we see every year are zoonotic. Some of those are wildlife origin. More of those are actually domestic livestock origin. And that's more just because we have more interaction with domestic livestock and some of the conditions that they're in. But that's just what happens. Ultimately, it's all biology, and we have enough close, relations for how we all work that it is inevitable, and really under any system, that there's going to be some jump between animal systems and human systems in terms of infectious agents. But what ought to make us concerned, and what we need to think about, is that number has been rising over the last few decades, where the fraction of the diseases that we're seeing that are zoonotic, the overall numbers that we're seeing coming out of those animal systems, they're going up, and they're going up with every decade. And again, those of us who work in the field knew that would happen, and that's predictable. And that's just because of our ever expanding footprint. The more that we move into these parts of the world, the more that we deforest places, the more that we create systems for food and in particular, but other systems that concentrate people with animals in varying ways, the higher those kinds of risks become. And I'm gonna turn my email off so we don't keep getting beeps coming through. And that's just reality, right? And there's some interesting examples if we look historically, even if we set aside just the COVID-19 thing at the moment, things that we've all heard of that haven't had the same level of impact on our country and the world, but have had their impact in all of them. And so, and that are really clear examples of showing what the risks are of just ignoring the environment side of what we're doing and what that can bring. So two in this country that we're dealing with a lot, both West Nile virus and Lyme disease. And, for those of you of my age or beyond, right, I can still remember back when, let me put it this way. So when I was in college, my undergraduate thesis consisted of trapping a whole bunch of white-footed mice in the forests of Massachusetts and then doing a variety of things with them in this animal behavior experiment. If I had to do that today, the risk of that would be hugely different because white-footed mice end up being one of the primary vectors of the ticks that are Lyme disease carriers. Just 30 plus years ago when I was doing it, I wasn't even on my radar. We didn't think about that. It just really wasn't there yet. So what happened? I mean, is that some newly evolved thing that came out of nowhere? And the answer is no. That it was around. It's more a product of what the changes to the landscape have been within this country, starting in the Northeast and beyond, where we've really reduced habitat for wildlife out there, and by reducing that habitat and turning it into these little postmark places of where they can live, the overall diversity or numbers of different animals have changed, and so the potential hosts for a disease like Lyme disease that goes through ticks narrow. It used to be that they could go to all kinds of things. They go to possums, they go to foxes, they go to you name it. And it's not that those things don't exist, but the numbers have really changed. And a lot of those animals ended up being pretty bad carriers for Lyme disease. And effectively, you can think of it as dead end. To use the analogy to today's, they provided a different kind of social isolation. That there was just a separation in the disease there where those would become kind of dead end things for it. Now, with huge numbers of increasing geese and deer in some ways, and especially these white-footed mice that tend to be very, very good carriers and amplifiers of the disease, the risk to us has gone up entirely because of a loss of biodiversity. Same thing is true for West Nile virus, that with greater bird diversity in the past, there were a number of birds that would be flying around that would get bit by these mosquitoes as an intermediate carrier for West Nile. And they were bad carriers, and essentially it would just sputter out. But as it turns out, crows and robins, which have taken off and done really well in our human-dominated landscape, also happen to be really good carriers and vectors for this disease. It doesn't have to work out that way. It can go the other way around, right? But it's just that the more that we narrow things, the more likely are we're going to see these jumps. And so that's happened. Another example I use from the past that some people don't know about as much, but is kind of an interesting one of how our economic systems and the way we run things can be tied to these risks. In 2009, we actually had a somewhat significant outbreak of dengue fever in southern states, and especially with a hotspot in Florida. And there was a whole bunch of stuff at the time that came out about, blanketing Florida with insecticides and doing all kinds of things and fighting back, and that, this must have been, what was this new thing? And it must have been coming from other countries, and, on and on and on, right? The whole thing. Well, the reality was that the mosquitoes that carry dengue have been in Florida forever. They're around, and the disease has been circulating now and then. The game changer, in part, at that time, was actually the foreclosure crisis, because we ended up having a whole bunch of homes that became abandoned and sat there, and a bunch of swimming pools then became stagnant, which became wonderful breeding sites for these mosquitoes, and they took off. So there are all these funny little connections between what we do as people and how that disease risk can come out. And then we've seen it played out in the years since, right? Ones that are famous. So the first SARS or MERS or Ebola or any of these are all linked to bats, just like COVID-19 is now. And we've heard a lot this year about the wet markets, or the so-called wildlife markets in China. And that probably was the origin of this one. Certainly those have been the origins of some other viruses coming out, and they're perfect incubators for that kind of crossover. What I think is key to remember is that they're far from the only one. We're seeing a lot of attention right now that our risk is all about, this particular country and part of the world and how they do things. And if we could get rid of that, we'd be fine. Nope, false. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of these different interaction points that comes, and that's just one of them. So that's where we are with this stuff. And if we keep as business as usual, that kind of stuff is going to keep going on. I'll bring back climate change. Climate change, one of the ways I think about that is that it's essentially a threat amplifier. And so that, it has its own issues. Things get too hot, things get too dry, all the rest. But when that happens, all the other stuff we're dealing with can just get amplified in terms of its risk because of it. So as things get, say, warmer and wetter in some regions, then you really do get the ability of certain diseases or certain carriers of disease to move into new regions where they won't, and for that to interact with, say, a climate-related disaster where people are more vulnerable and the outbreak of disease is more likely. So that crossover of these different environmental issues is just increasingly coming into our face. And you know, again, I don't want to depress. That's real. Those are real issues that we have to look at. Those are real issues we have to contend with. They're ones we can contend with, and the only way we contend with is to take them on honestly and start thinking about how we shift and move forward. So maybe I'll stop with that because I think you don't have a lot of time, and then just say if y'all have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
That was great. I'll start with the question, Alan. I really appreciate your insight and your knowledge. I did share your website with people in the chat if people want to click on it. I'm very attracted to your thoughts on the hope and agency of where we are, and I think that companies like ours that are looking for ways to create tremendous impact through some of our things we're investing in. Have an opportunity here for sure. If from your perspective, just kind of off the top of your head, what would be the largest area of impact somebody like a holding company who's kind of trying to modernize the Berkshire Hathaway approach? What should we be looking to invest in to have the greatest impact from your perspective? That was a tough one.
I'll say that investment advice for me is going to be worth just as much as you're paying for it. So I think that the more organizations that look towards investing in sustainable practices and technologies, the more that ball gets rolling where, maybe, and I know this is not a new answer and it's a bit 30,000 foot, but I actually think it's really important, right? So one of the things that I try to talk to young people a lot in classes is to help them recognize that we don't have all of the technical solutions we need yet to address some of these, but we actually have a lot of them. And a lot of it at this point is about implementation and growth of markets and shifting practices. It's not about inventing some brand new mousetrap we don't know about yet. And so, allowing renewable energy technologies to take off again, allowing agricultural practices to thrive and go forward that have less risk and less damage. We know how to do a lot of that. It comes down to them having the financial backing and security and growth to pull it off and become more competitive in a market. And so that's where I think companies like this and in general can have the greatest effect. I know when I was at Duke, for those of you who know, I led their environment school there for a while. And one of the most interesting conversations I had there and partnerships we talked about was actually with a woman who used to be one of the senior folks at Goldman Sachs, who was at Duke and teaching some economics and investment classes. And we got talking a lot about, the growth in, these so-called ESG funds and all the rest and what the market was like, but how there was a gap in some ways between products that were being marketed and put within the financial landscape and their ability to really evaluate the science behind them. So if somebody is saying, here's a green fund that's really making a difference, well, does it really make a difference from a scientific standpoint? So building those bridges is, I think, a good thing to do for organizations so that you can get ways to say, yep, this one would actually work in the ways it's being claimed. And then if that's true, starting to support those, I think can start to be a real game changer.
No, that's great. Yeah, we're one of our biggest things that we are contending is the greenwashing that's going on. So I think making it real is a big deal. I'll let others talk and really appreciate it, Alan. It was outstanding.
Yeah, you bet.
Alan, this is Mark White. You said a fair bit about biodiversity, and I'm really curious to know, do you think that decreasing biodiversity is inevitable and that's why we're going to be seeing more and more of these, or we are seeing more and more, or should we be somehow figuring out how to foster more diversity?
So thanks, Mark, for the question. And parts of it are inevitable, I think. I mean, that's part of the the momentum that's baked into changes we've made in the landscape, coupled with the climate changes that we probably can't avoid, coupled with some other factors that are just undoubtedly going to lead to some greater species extinctions or shifts in the composition of what's out there and an overall loss of some biodiversity. And we can't get around it. And there are some scary scenarios there. And we just have to prepare and do that. Now, again, in that one, I'd still say, though, it's every bit in the same realm as thinking about climate in general. We are not too late to make really substantial differences. And in fact, we've seen tangible evidence. When you put the right mechanisms in place that can do a better job of marrying people and nature and not necessarily kill economic systems or the rest, you can see recovery in a lot of these systems, sometimes even much more quickly than you think. And so what's really at risk in some ways is if we look at the longer list of truly more threatened and rare species, many of them are probably in trouble and many of them will probably lose. That breaks my heart for a whole separate set of reasons. And in some cases, the loss of some of those could be really important for things that directly matter to human wellness. But a lot of the protection that's conferred by biodiversity in general doesn't necessarily rest on only those super rare and threatened species. It just rests more on more diverse and functioning ecosystems. And so those become different categories. One general example that I would say that a positive one is that putting in place marine protected areas, which has been a conservation mechanism that's been going for a couple decades now in a number of places, has been a huge success story, where you can find parts of the ocean that are set aside, restricted from fishing for a while or lowered for impact for a while where others aren't. And then you can open them up back and forth, but done right, you can find ways where actually the fisheries really recover in ways you needed to make them work economically, but at the same time, the functioning of the whole system comes back much more dramatically as well. So we can still do a lot, but we do have to get going.
Good question, Mark. Thank you. Anyone else from our guests have a question? Feel free.
My name's Peter Beerbaum. Alan, I consult in the environmental health and safety industry. And what I've seen from clients is frankly, a shift towards health and safety sometimes at the cost of dropping environmental considerations, at least in the short term, if not in the longer term. And even some of the policies I see coming out of government to address concerns with health and safety also seem to put environmental to the side. Do you have suggestions on good communication practices to simplify showing the link with regards to some of the concerns when talking to the general public, to consultants, to decision makers?
Yeah, I can try. It's a great question, and I agree. I see that too. I would say a couple things about that as general principles that we may know, but they're really important to keep in mind, and they're really important to lose sight of. When I know for me anyway, it's taken me a long time to learn these lessons as a scientist. Is that one, there's a great analogy to the old saying that all politics is local, and so really thinking about what the local situation is in terms of that link to the environment and where the examples are there that people can resonate with. And that's the second one, which is trying to meet people where they are and to kind of find the common bridge between the message you're sending and their experience is supposed to be. So, just as a simplistic or off the cuff examples, if I was worried about water pollution and biodiversity and feedbacks that could do and what that might mean and why we needed to protect that, it also links the economic system. And I was having that conversation with folks in New Orleans, let's say, I would talk about Mississippi River pollution and the dead zone and what that does to the shrimp industry, and then kind of go from there, because there would be a connection. If I was having that conversation with folks who live in Mexico City, I probably talk about air pollution and what comes from there, and then kind of extend from there. And so I try to think about where is that local experience connection that people actually feel and see, and then hopefully have some, when it's ready, some numbers in my pocket to go forward. One of the hardest lessons I've learned as a scientist, who's, very much guided by numbers and data and experiments and all the rest, is that you know, we like to say rely on science, and we have to rely on science, and it's critical. But as human beings, we all know this, right? Even it happens to me, if I'm honest with myself, is that when somebody just comes at you with numbers and graphs and all the rest, and it often just doesn't work very well. It does sometimes, but so when I've taught classes on science communication or work with things, which I have, you know, one of the things I always say is you've got to lead with the heart and let the head come behind. And I really, that's how people respond. And so I try to find those connections first. And then when I can do that, then usually you can start talking about numbers and ways that they'll do it. And the last thing I'll say is that just a separate one for what you're dealing with here is that in that health and wellness one, and you may have seen reference to this more in the news that we're doing right now, there's a whole concept and even a whole organization wrapped around something called One Health right now. And One Health is really the emergent property of conservation biologists and wildlife ecologists and disease ecologists and physicians and public health people and the rest, recognizing that ultimately our health and wellness as humans is integrally related to the environment around us and the ecosystems on which we depend. And you have to think about those interacting elements to even really plan for our own wellness best. And there's some great examples through those organizations.
Hey, Dr. Townsend.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Meg.
Go ahead, Dave.
Hey, so I have, I tend to look at things as opportunities. And one of the things that I've been curious about related to COVID-19, and I want to get your take on it, is, first of all, is I think we've realized that we all need to wash our hands better, right? And then I wonder sometimes with all the soap not in the grocery stores, what was everybody else doing? But we're going to move on from that. So do you think that this type of social distancing and maybe new way of hygiene will eradicate the flu? Do you think the flu will be impacted by this necessary time to fight COVID-19? Do you think the flu will be different, maybe in a good way? What do you think?
It's a good question. I think the short answer is, for the most part, no. But it won't go away. And in some ways, that's due to the specific, somewhat insidious nature of what seasonal flu viruses are. They're efficient little beasts, and they evolve very quickly and very effectively. I mean, it's the reason every year that our flu vaccine is this guessing game, where you're having to guess at what the genetic structure specifically of this year's coming flu virus is and hope you match it the best you can, because we know it's a quickly evolving virus. And it's just so much in circulation and so quickly adaptable to its host systems that completely eradicating it is really difficult. Now, that said, everything that we're doing right now, and you know, we're doing it in a really extreme version that we obviously can't keep up forever. But I agree with you, if we carry some lessons forward as a global society for this, just for daily practices of how we interact, what we do, maybe some things we don't do anymore in the same way, could it start to have really meaningful effects? Absolutely. You know, could it lower the risk every season to everybody? Without question. Could it, in particular, lower the risks of a more novel flu-like virus coming out and doing what this one has done and spreading really rapidly? You bet. Those early parts of the curve in an exponential growth scenario are absolutely everything. And we're seeing some of that now. So every little thing that we do that changes the early part of that curve dynamic to a harder one for a virus to climb increases the chance that it just runs into a dead end. Doesn't necessarily eliminate it, but it just sort of, you know, goes through its year and sputters a little bit before going into the next year. So I do think there's potentially some real positive outcome, you know, if we don't all walk out of this in a year and go, whew, that sucked, and now we're just back to business as usual.
Cool, thank you. I have hope.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah. Let's do one or two more questions, and then we can wrap it up. Anyone else have anything they'd like to ask Dr. Townsend?
It looks like Brendan Morrison did.
Yeah.
Brendan, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question for you to just kind of pick your brain. I've always kind of been a history nerd, and I can't help it, but can't help but look at stuff in historical context. So if you look at the flu, 1918, it kind of flares up in the spring, kind of goes away in the summer, and then comes back with a vengeance in the fall. If you look at what we're going through, we're kind of through the first parts of that, it seems like. It's starting to go down into the summer. with modern medical science being what it is, I guess what would be your opinion that this virus will follow a similar track? And how can we prevent that, I guess?
Yeah, huge question, obviously. And so thanks for asking that. A couple things that I will say on that. It's absolutely critical. One thing you raised, that the 1918 flu operated in a very, very different world. In one sense, much harder for a virus to get around the world in the way it can today, because we didn't have the same level of globalization and connection, and yet it did. That should scare us for what these things can really do. But on the other hand, we just didn't have the same medical systems, and that had a huge consequence for what went on, as a level of understanding. That has been used a lot. Many of you have probably seen is kind of this hope that as things warm up and go into the summer, it'll suppress the spread and infectivity of this particular virus. From a biological standpoint, from the current research that we have, I would say most of the evidence suggests that's probably not the case. That if there's a temperature sensitivity to the spread and risk of this virus, it's a modest one at best. That's emerging both from lab-based studies, and then even if you just look at what's going on, I mean, we're seeing rapid exponential spread in some countries that are plenty warm and hot right now when it's going on. And so that's, but even when you look at the ones that have more viruses that have more of a real temperature sensitivity, from a public health perspective, if it's spreading to this level and being a real epidemic or even pandemic, that usually can't be counted on to be the game changer. The game changer in the end is about our practice and public health behavior and just kind of getting the dead ends in place that are there. So it's probably not going to save us for that at all. To your question, even if it did, if things really chilled out in terms of its spread in the summer, we really would expect the analogy to 1918, which is as things cooled off, we came back together, we dried out, that we'd see another wave. I think what's more important on this one is to recognize that subsequent waves are essentially inevitable. This is not a sprint, this is a marathon. And there's just no way around it. And there's big uncertainty in that. And those biggest uncertainties are both about our own level of collective behavior globally, how we do it, how we distance what we do and what we don't do, and then what level of therapeutic interventions we're able to find out of the health system over the next few months, and how effective are they. Lots of talk about a vaccine. Hopefully we get a good one eventually. Hopefully we get one on the fastest time track ever. There's some cautious optimism and hope for that to happen, but it'll still be months out. One thing that we can hope for there is antivirals, and a good cocktail of antivirals can essentially work the same way a vaccine does. And those could come along too, and they could come along faster if we can find it. And we're seeing a whole hell of a lot of work and research on that. So if either or both of those come earlier rather than later, that will really change. I mean, what those do is create the analogy essentially effectively to some level of herd immunity where you're not immune, but the risks of it are much lower, or the vaccine does confer the immunity. And so then we could get back to our lives. There is a paper that just came out this week in Science, one of the leading journals, and this is from one of the best epidemiological teams in the world, that really looked at predicting what the future spread and dynamics of this will be. And again, they appropriately acknowledge that there are these uncertainties, and these uncertainties in both our behavior and therapeutic interventions are key to it, but that their bottom line conclusions are, we're likely to be with this through all of next calendar year, as if not, for a year or two, even beyond that, in some resurgence and waves. And that's a really sobering thing for us to take in, but I think it's a reality we have to come to grips with, that we're not going to eliminate it in the next few weeks, in the next few months. We're going to be living with the risk of that out there. And so we really have to think about how we lower that risk, and as we plan around it. If you were going to ask me to predict, given everything that we're doing right now, what's likely to happen next, I actually think some sort of fall resurgence at some level is likely, not so much because of the temperature issue, but because it'll be a response to things getting relaxed, or the virus taking off in other countries around the world that it hasn't yet, and then shifting back our way. There are a number of ways in which that could happen. So it's worth planning around.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Townsend. Any other questions before we wrap it up?
I got a quick one.
Mm-hmm.
So like what happened with 9/11 changed our lives and how we travel. How do you think this is going to change our everyday life moving forward and in the short term. And when I mean short term, like a year or two, and then long term.
It's a great question, Craig, and I don't know the answer other than I think that analogy will be there. One of the, you know, among some of my colleagues in this, we're all kind of saying the same thing, which is, you know, maybe a simple analogy is that we've gone around a corner on a road and that road's a one-way street. And I think that's going to be the case. What that means, I don't know. Right. It sort of means, do we learn our lessons? You know, the 9/11 analogy in some ways scares me because, through my own opinion, much of our response to 9/11 didn't actually lower our risk. It only restricted our lives, you know, in some new ways and created all kinds of new risks. This to me, you know, and I think this was Dave before saying this, I really hope we see this as an opportunity to learn some lessons, to change behaviors in ways that lower our risk and in the right ways, that we change practice. That doesn't mean that we can't do the things we all like to do and that we can't kind of work the way we want, but that we recognize here are some things that maybe we should do differently to lower that risk. A lot of that, which is unfortunate right now, is the recognition that that risk won't go away anytime soon. And I don't just mean this disease in general in our modern practice. And what we can't do is what this country did recently in this one, which is to kind of ignore or divest from the detection, protection, and prevention systems that we just have to have. Mm-hmm. And when those are strong and when they're globally strong, and then we have globally coordinated policy responses that are really quick, then the overall impact can actually be kept really low in most of those. You can make a virus like this sputter out pretty fast if you jump on it quickly, if the detection is early, if you do the things that you need to do to figure out where it is and just stop it in its tracks. For this specifically, I hope that's the lesson we learn as a global society, is that we can actually put in place the detection and observation and response networks that, you know, in an analogous situation in the future, would have had us doing what we're doing right now in mid-January, not in mid-March. And that would have been a game changer.
Yeah,
Very good. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Well, on that note, I want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Townsend for joining us, and thanks to everyone on the call. It's been very enlightening, very hopeful in many ways, and that's always what I try to leave our calls with, is something positive. So I hope we can all walk away with the understanding that we're going to get through this and we can make a positive change on so many levels, including the environment. So appreciate everyone's interest and intention and mission, and wishing everyone safety and good health. And we hope to see you back here next Friday. We'll do another Coffee with CoPeace. So